You're good to go, Ruth.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so very, very much for joining us this morning on our very first webinar for this year out of 6. And I'm absolutely delighted with the subject matter. I'm going to do a few housekeeping items, and then I will be turning it over to our expert once I do a little introduction of Mr. Eni. Most important, I must thank our funders, and they are the Secrétariat de Relations avec les Québécois d'Expression Anglaise and Educadoi. And as you know, we've asked you to keep your microphones muted. We are recording this, so it makes it much easier for editing and for the reproduction afterwards, because we do repost the recording of today's session on Seniors Action Quebec's media pages, its website, its YouTube channel, and we distribute it to our partners in the regions. We are a provincial organization, so that they can use it with their membership and people who are unable to join us today. So I thank you for understanding that. The other thing we will ask you to do, we have 3 specific segments of the agenda. George will be talking about particular topics. After each one, there will be a 10-minute question and answer period. As you think of your question, please put it in the chat box, which is usually along the bottom of your screen if you just jiggle your mouse, and type it in, and Anne will be asking George the question. And everybody will receive a recording who registered, who attended, in approximately 3 to 4 days following today. So I think I've given you all the information. There will be a survey. I'm going to mention it now in case I forget at the end of the session. There will be a survey sent to each one of you. We ask you seriously to please take the time and fill it out. This is information and data that the funders collect, and it enables Seniors Action Quebec to continue to get more funds in order to bring more timely and important topics to you. I think I've handled most of the business of the day. So now it's my delight, my pleasure, my thrill to introduce a longtime friend of mine, who I believe is Canada's car expert, Mr. George Eni, who is the Director of Automobile Protection Association. He's also the co-author of Lemonade, New and Used Book Car Guide. And if you didn't know, George has undertaken more than 30 field investigations of automobile retailing and repairs for government and for the media in 5 Canadian provinces. George has written and been interviewed extensively by major Canadian print, radio, television media about car financing, leasing, sales practices, safety, warranties, recalls, and other auto-related topics. If that wasn't enough, he also has represented us, the consumer, before committees of the Senate and the House of Commons and Quebec's Assemblée Nationale. And on top of that, he serves on these consumer advisory committees for both federal and provincial governments. So without further ado, because it's not me you want to hear from, you want to hear from George himself, and he's going to run the show. We will keep an eye on the time, do our question and answer period. There will be one health break. George, thank you, thank you, thank you. And it's your show. Away you go.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be with you. I'm the Director of the Automobile Protection Association, the APA. We have offices in Montreal and Toronto. The association is a child of the 1960s, so it came up in a period when there was a significant questioning of the role of corporations and their lack of, at the time, a perception that the auto companies had a complete lack of social responsibility. Things have evolved quite a bit. Tailpipes are 99% cleaner than they were back then. Vehicles offer far superior crash protection in a collision. Fuel economy is somewhat better, not as much as you would think, because vehicles are also bigger and heavier than they were at one time. Today, the APA remains an advocacy association, and we're now entering a period of significant change again, where they're calling into question the use of gasoline, for example, to power vehicles. I think that will be probably the most significant change in vehicles in the last, since really the vehicles became popular in the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, there's also automated driving. So that there's a number of different features that are going to be introduced that will sort of take, it'll be the equivalent of what automatic transmissions were 50 years ago, when you didn't have, it got you out of driving a manual transmission, although now it will be taking over the steering and the brakes of the vehicle instead. Today, we're still an advocacy association. We're small, it's just 7 staff in the 2 offices. And we basically operate, we have our ear to the ground, so we have complaint hotlines where we listen to you or answer your emails. And we are an aggregator. So even though there is the web that has made the circulation of information much easier, it made it much easier to find another person like you out there with the same problem, there is still a significant place for old style hearing of complaints and also investigating them and curating the complaints in such a way that you don't end up with a lot of scatter, but that you actually have good advice. Right now, among our other files, we're in a class action against Nissan for defective automatic transmissions. Quebec is the only holdout. Nissan got a very, very favorable deal negotiated with lawyers for the 9 other provinces. The lawyers were paid handsomely, over $1 million, and about half the claims are excluded. So we know we're not interested in an offer like that, and so we're continuing our action in Quebec. And it's, as far as I know, the only place in North America, even though Nissan has been sued more than 10 times, where someone is holding out for fair compensation. We were involved and still involved in a case against fuel retailers over price fixing. I don't think it's a surprise to most people that there is some collusion in the retail price of gasoline. It's not that much. In other words, the impact on the price that you pay at the pump is not as high as you might think. It's not 25 cents. It's more in the range of 2 to 6 cents. And we got the companies to agree just before a significant court date to reimbursement of about $10 million. And that was for 4 markets in the Eastern Township. And we're continuing our action for the North Shore and the Lower St. Lawrence and Quebec City, where there was evidence of similar practices on pricing. So that's it for the APA. I mean, I'll add, sorry, we also do car testing, and our new vehicle reviews are available for free to everybody on the association's website. So let's get to the first part of the presentation, which is shortages of vehicles. We haven't seen anything like this since the 1980s. People may remember a period where the Japanese car makers voluntarily restricted their imports of vehicles. And in those days, people were waiting 6 months for a Honda or a Toyota to come in, and they were paying full retail. Even that, though, didn't affect all brands, because you could get a domestic vehicle or a European vehicle if you wanted. They weren't selling as well. To go back to the next period when we've had these shortages would have been in the 1950s. So that was during the Korean War, where there were shortages of materials, and it was a period of relatively high inflation, also rapid price increases after the Second World War. For most people, though, what they remember, what we're used to, is extreme abundance. New vehicles, overproduction, discounting, fairly stable prices. In other words, although the prices of vehicles increased, the features on the vehicles increased as well. And when you corrected for that, from roughly 2000 till 2019, we really were getting a lot of additional value for not much more money in a new vehicle. So all of that came to an end with COVID. The car makers ran out of a supply computer chips. They're competing with other users of those chips. So the cell phone and computer businesses don't use exactly the same chips, but apparently they're able to tie up some of the production. The car makers were expecting a repeat of 2008. So after the financial crisis in the US, car markets slowed down all over the world. For the next 2 years in Canada, sales were down by 20 or 25%. So when COVID started in that first month and we were all at home, they trimmed all their orders, all their forecasting, expecting the same thing. And what they thought of is that when people came back into the market, it would be like in 2009 and 2010. Small cars or less equipped vehicles would be what people would be buying. In fact, COVID had the opposite effect. As soon as confinement was lifted, even when there were still significant restrictions, but you could go out of your house for shopping other than food and pharmaceuticals, people roared out of their homes and they bought, among other things, new decks, in-ground pools, but also bigger, larger, more equipped automobiles. So the industry wasn't ready for it. And as a consequence, we had our first and now sustained shortage in most people's memory. So the first thing that disappeared were rebates on cars. So the manufacturer cash backs are mostly gone. Dealer discounts disappeared. Dealers are selling at full retail. And also the financing, as interest rates rose and as car makers realized they didn't have to try so hard to sell a vehicle, the 0% and 1.9% interest rates we had seen before bumped up to 2.9 to 5.9%. So the interest rates on car financing have come up as well. The effect of all of that is that a new car at the end of the day is significantly more expensive than it was before. And also, surprisingly, people aren't trimming or dialing back, quite the opposite. They want the features, they want their SUV somewhat larger than the compact car they're driving today. And in many cases, even when they've switched over to a different model or not their first choice or not their first color, they haven't necessarily dropped the price. So that has in a way exacerbated the shortage because the demand is greatest for the vehicles with the most components, the most parts on them. And the industry is taking advantage of it. So car makers, after their labor cost, one of their biggest expenses, car dealers, is what's called floor planning. So that's financing the roughly 200 vehicles that you would have on your lot as inventory and that you're keeping on average 60 to 90 days and sometimes more. So with COVID, they now have 15 vehicles on their lot and they're keeping them 2 weeks or 30 days at most. In many cases, they're able to sell the car before they have to pay the manufacturer his bill. So as a consequence, it's a very profitable time for new car dealerships, and they're selling dealerships themselves at record levels. It's a bit like real estate. If you're selling a car dealership, the multiples you're getting today are greater than they ever would have been before. The values you're getting are much greater. Many dealers also didn't hire back their full sales force. They don't have to because people are buying. They're not visiting and comparing at 5 different places. The minute they find a place that has what they want, they're signing and they're paying full retail. So in some cases, staff has been trimmed as well. And it's hard on the salespeople. Most of them only get their commission paid when the vehicle is delivered. So if I sign you up in May and your car comes in next December, I'm eating macaroni and cheese for the next 7 or 8 months. And also the delivery date that I promised you that turned out to be phony, that wasn't 3 or 4 months, didn't only impact you, but in many cases impacted me as a salesperson. So that has created some stresses, and some dealers are now giving an upfront amount to salespeople. They're paying them part of the commission ahead of time before the delivery. For a consumer, that essentially means you're hoping not to pay more than the suggested retail price. dealers, rather than being more generous because they're making more money, got more greedy. So because there are fewer vehicles and because they have a bigger stick, they are now piling on extra charges. So we're seeing dealers adding administration fees. In some cases, they're requiring that you take their financing, which pays them a commission from the bank, even if you didn't need it. We found one dealer that was adding optional equipment features that were already standard on that model of vehicle. So it was a pickup truck, and they charged extra for a bed liner and a few other features that on that version of the truck were already included. So there are different tricks that are using. Most people are aware of it and they're paying, and that's just the way it is. So we at the association offer a co-op buying service for members. In a good year, typically we would be doing about 400 or 500 vehicles out of the 2 offices. And the customers get a fixed, no haggle price, a very significant discount from a regular retail price, but also a knowledgeable salesperson and no tricks. Nobody's going to see the manager to bump you up. We also like the fact that all of the members paid roughly, buying the same model, pay the same price, regardless of their ability to negotiate. So in these times, there is no more discount. Our membership have to line up like everybody else. The dealers don't have enough vehicles, so they're waiting 6 months or more as well. For an electric vehicle or a hybrid, the wait could be a year or longer. But there is still the advantage that you're going to get the straight goods when you're going to shop through a recommended person. So it's something to consider. And also, if you don't want to be traipsing around too much, a lot of the work can be done over the phone because you're dealing with somebody that you trust. You'll want to be there in person for the delivery and possibly to see the vehicle, but many people don't want to shop around to 5 places to find out if something is available or to get the real story. Used cars is even more changed. First of all, used cars don't have a published manufacturer's suggested retail price. So the retail price on used is determined entirely by the market. We had for many years, at least since 2005, a real abundance of used vehicles and good prices. You could get a 3-year-old lease return at 40% off new all day long on most models. In some cases, a discount would have been even higher after 4 or 5 years. So what's happened now is many new car buyers can't wait. So they're looking at 3-year-old lease returns. So they're now competing for those same cars with used car buyers. But that's not all. The American market is having the same shortage. The American market is 10 times our size, and it's voraciously hungry for SUVs and well-equipped luxury vehicles. And so what happens is at Canadian dealer auctions, when vehicles are coming in, American pickers are taking those vehicles, they're buying them with a dollar that's 25 or 30% stronger. And so they're vacuuming a significant portion of the used vehicle supply out of the country. This has happened before, but generally never before in a period when there were also not enough new cars. So as a consequence, there are both new car buyers and American buyers competing for the same supply of used cars. And so prices have gone up by about 30 to 40%. It's not even across the board. It's worse for some classes of vehicles than others. So the more popular vehicles, the SUVs, pickup trucks, much more expensive. But even compact cars, we're seeing 3-year-old Hyundais, an Elantra selling for $1,000 or $2,000 less than a brand new one. Now, why would somebody buy a 3-year-old car for $1,000 less than a new one? And the answer is time. They can't wait 4 months for a new car. And if you want the vehicle immediately, if you want the convenience of that, then you're going to be buying a used car by the top dollar. So our advice to people who are in the market right now or considering coming into the market is, if you have a chance, postpone your purchase. We will probably not go back in the foreseeable period to what we knew before, but the supply situation will begin to ease up. Maybe it will take until next summer, And it has to start with new cars, because when the supply of new cars improves and the wait times go down, the new car buyers will stop poaching the used car in the used car market, and that will allow the supply of vehicles to build up. Right now, supply remains very tight, and if you are ordering a new vehicle, typically the wait is going to be 3 to 6 months. If it's an electric or hybrid vehicle, it could be longer. In used, I think that probably the peak prices were this spring and this summer. Again, a little bit like real estate, but the availability is still low and prices remain very high. And in many cases, what people are doing who are buying used is, if they would have traditionally bought a 3 or 4 year old vehicle, they're now going back to a 5 to 7 year old vehicle, and they've often increased their budget by $4,000 or $5,000. Surprisingly, the one thing that we had expected at the APA was a return to 2008, 2010, that people would be making an austerity purchase. There are terrific small vehicles out there. The level of equipment in a small vehicle, if you want, can rival a luxury vehicle. I mean, there's a ton of equipment available on them. They have, in many cases, better infotainment. So the system that pairs with your phone is superior, more convenient than on many luxury models if you're buying a less expensive car. But in fact, that hasn't happened. People have not gone frugal. What they've done is stood their position and generally picked a vehicle that will more or less pamper them compared to what they have today. So it's a different behavior than what we saw before. And I actually, we look at it and we're surprised, because we missed that would be the trend the market has taken. It seems to have been very durable. It wasn't just the first 2 or 3 months after COVID, it's continuing. And I'd be interested to hear from people if they have anything to say on that, say what that motivation might be. So that's it for this part of the presentation. Ruth, are we at a break time yet or not?
We'll go to questions, George, if you are game.
Sure.
Anne, do you have any? People type your questions in the chat box, please.
Good morning, George. Thank you very much for this workshop. It's very interesting. We do have a question. Has the cost of gasoline changed consumers' purchasing?
The cost of gasoline changes consumer language. But what happens is gasoline prices come down. They're doing that now, and people go back to their old habits. So they may have postponed their purchase. They didn't downsize in most cases. What it did do this spring is it increased the conversation around electric vehicles and hybrids. So many more people started to consider a hybrid, maybe not a vehicle that you can plug in, but a vehicle that has a dual system inside and that will do some of its driving on electric power, but it's a gasoline fueled vehicle. And some people were considering, do I make the switch to a vehicle I can plug in? In fact, the car makers are more or less at maximum capacity for both those classes of vehicles. They can't really make many more of them, particularly vehicles you can plug in. So the wait times for electric vehicles went up, but now the prices are coming down. If the past is any guide, people will go back to their old behaviors. It's an odd thing because a brand new vehicle, if you're buying new, lasts 15 years. So really, if you're making an energy decision, it should be based, if not on 15 years, at least on the 7 or 8 years that you're going to own the car. But in practice, what really happens is we base it on the price of gasoline over the last 6 weeks, roughly. It's a kind of a short-term view. And what we can expect going forward, again, is instability around the cost of fuel because of the geopolitical aspects. It just, other than Canada and the US, many of the places where fuel is, oil is produced are places where either they're involved in cartel pricing because they want to get a fair value for their resources, and Canada follows. We follow the world price. We don't sell it cheaper to ourselves or to the US because we follow the world market, and or there's political instability. And that both of those result in volatility, something that your utility that produces electricity doesn't do. People are much more comfortable with their electricity bill because it moves in increments or doesn't move at all. So bottom line, there aren't more electric cars out there, but when gas prices goes up, the demand for them goes up, so more people are signing for future delivery.
Okay, great. And we have another question. Is it better for seniors to lease new cars or to buy them, in your opinion?
So dealers love seniors who lease new cars. So it's better for the dealer. And here's why. A lease vehicle you're turning in every 4 years. Typically, at the very least, you bought 60 or 80,000 kilometers of mileage with it. But a senior doesn't commute to work anymore. A senior may spend a good part of the winter in the US and is probably not driving that much per year on their core vehicle. So they're turning it in at 4 years with about 30 to 40,000 kilometers, but they paid for 60 or 80. That's a gift to the dealer and the manufacturer. And seniors typically also don't abuse their vehicles. So that's a vehicle that won't cost too much to recondition. Many seniors also come from a period where, at least when they were younger, things were dear, they cost more. And there's a tendency or orientation, at least we see this with cars, to consider it as something that you would look after better. So you're not just doing oil changes, you're concerned about security and maintaining the value of the expenditure that you made on the car. And so all of those reasons mean a senior turning in a car that is still perfectly functional every 4 years is a real big gift to a dealer. And dealers love it. The other problem is if you're sick with the lease, it's harder to get out of a vehicle and you're more likely to be what's called upside down and owe money. So there are people who are not able to drive anymore, stuck with a lease, and a quite expensive payout if they want to get out of it. These days, that's not true anymore because of what's happened in the market. So in many cases, that danger of leasing, which is that you're kind of handcuffed to the vehicle for the full 4 years, even if your health changes, isn't as true as it was before. It's easier to get out. So I would say if you want to change every 4 years, that's your wish. Someone will tell us, listen, I like a nice car. I'm still golfing. So I take my buddies. It has to be pretty large. We need to have 4 golf bags in it. And I'm pampering myself. I know I want a luxury car. We'll say then in that case, by all means, if you know you're changing frequently, you should lease. It's usually the better way to get in and out of a vehicle frequently, but it's a more expensive way. And certainly when we see a recently widowed person who's 88 years old or 86 years old being pushed by a dealership into a 5-year lease, when there's no guarantee that they're going to be driving that many years from now, we read between the lines. And the salesperson was thinking of themselves at the expense of the person leasing.
Thank you. And you also mentioned good smaller cars. Are you able to name a few of them by any chance?
For sure. And if you want to also go look online, there are the APA reviews that are up as well for 2022. So among some of the smaller vehicles that cost very little to run, so these are vehicles where you will have some protection from the price of gasoline if it goes up, because they don't require much fuel and are reasonably reliable. The Toyota Corolla, it's available as a hybrid, but the hybrid in almost every Toyota model is nearly unobtainable, unfortunately. So most people are opting for the gas car. From Mazda, the 3, also a nice vehicle. It's a little smaller. Some people find it cramped. It's a bit lower as well to get into. Honda, the Civic, a very good vehicle. From Hyundai and Kia make beautiful designs. The reliability is only average at best, but 2 of their best vehicles, and funnily enough, the ones that need the least repairs, are their 2 entry-level vehicles. So from Hyundai, a vehicle called the Venue. The Venue is sort of like a toaster in terms of the design. So it's a hatchback, but it's not the height of an SUV, but it's taller than a car. It does everything you need. It'll seat 4 people, and it's very reasonably priced. Kia has probably the best small car on the market right now of the little cars. That's the Kia Rio. So that's a size below the Corolla and the other models I mentioned. So Venue, Rio, also from Kia, a car that seniors like because of the height and because it's trim overall, the Kia Soul. That's also a convenient vehicle.
Okay.
So those are some models.
Okay, thank you. And Lorraine has mentioned that she had a Ford Fiesta and changed it to a Crosstrek for comfort because she has back issues. Is it easier to get an SUV than a lower car, in your opinion?
In terms of availability?
Back issues. If you have back issues, which one would you choose?
So what you try and do is pick a vehicle that's in between. So it's called your hip point. And ideally, you'd want a vehicle where your hip height, sitting down in the seat is not so low, and the twisting motion to get out does not require you to bend your head. So that's an in-between type of vehicle, like the Hyundai that I mentioned, the Venue, like the Kia Soul. There are also some cars that are a bit taller. Typically, Subarus are among them. It's one of the reasons why they're popular. The Crosstrek is exactly that as well. It's an in-between height. It's lower than most SUVs, but taller than most cars, just a little bit. It makes a difference. Unfortunately, in many cases, styling, because things that are low and sleek look better, will determine a roof line or how low the seat is. It's unfortunate only because for a couple of more inches, people would have a lot more facility getting in and out.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. Thank you for that answer. You also mentioned that prices have risen by 30 to 40%. Does that increase affect both new and used cars?
So the increase of 40% or 30 plus is used cars, and they were more impacted than new. New vehicles, it's between 20 and let's say 20 and 30%. It's not the published price for the car. That hasn't gone up all that much. And the manufacturers have been quite disciplined about the full suggested retail price. So those have gone up maybe by $1,000, $1,500 for the entry-level model year over year. So for the lowest model in the trim line, if it was 27 last year, there's a good chance it's 28 this year, maybe 29 or 27, 28 and a half. But the difference is no more discount. So the dealer is not giving you back $700 or $800. No more 0%. So you're now paying a few $1,000s in interest. And also the manufacturer at certain times of the year was giving a rebate of $500 or $1,000 or $1,500. In most cases, those rebates are gone.
Okay, well, thank you. And we just have one last observation, I guess, or question before we take the break. Why are there so many white cars? People are asking why there's so many white cars on the road. Is there statistics on that?
There are many white cars. So the three most popular colors are white, black, and some shade of gray. And white sort of has swings. Black is sort of perennially popular, and gray has been, silver or gray have been very popular for roughly 25 or 30 years. But white has come into fashion. And in fact, a used white car could be worth $500 or $1,000 more than the car in any other color. So the manufacturers have realized this. Initially, white was mainly for service vehicles because you could put lettering on the side. But now there are new types of white. They're called pearl white. They're extra finishes. They're putting little beads in the paint so that it has a little more depth or luster. And the public is crazy for white. Particularly, by the way, it's regional. So in some markets, for example, in Vancouver, white is more popular even than here. And they say it's because of the immigration from Asia, that Asian market customers love white. And it's true in other regions as well. And obviously in the US, in the South, it was always a color that was associated with like Florida, like Palm Beach. But now it's a much more widespread interest.
Okay, well, thank you, George. I think that's all the time we have for questions right now, and I'll hand it over to Ruth. Thank you, because if I get another car, I will get a white one. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. They were most interesting. Now we have a break. Maximum 10 minutes. If you can come back and maybe in 7, that would be great. And we'll see you all back here at about, well, no later than 5 to 11, because we still have 2 other segments. So stretch, grab a coffee, and we'll see you shortly. I think that was most interesting. And George, thank you. And I'm just going to turn it right to you for the next segment, which I guess we're all very interested in: gas versus hybrid versus electric. It's all yours.
So we're going to, for the next part of section, try and take a look into the future, where we are now, and maybe what we'll be seeing in the next 10 years. Very hard to predict the future with any level of accuracy, but there are some things that we do know. So right now, to drive a new vehicle, you're spending probably about $2,000 a year for fuel, for gasoline. For the level of, even though we think the price is high at the pump, for the level of mobility, it's actually pretty cheap. You know, for the level of convenience that you get, you're not paying tolls to use the road compared to other ways of getting around, where you might, you know, hiring a driver. Only really municipal transit, you know, would give you a very significant savings for getting from place to place as an individual, not on a schedule. But the electric vehicle promises you savings, because right now governments don't tax electricity that you use for the road any different than electricity that you use for your house, whereas about half the price of gasoline is taxes. So there's an indirect subsidy. It's not only the $12,000 that you get when you're buying a brand new electric vehicle, but there's also an extra gift of $1,000 a year. So over the life of a vehicle, which is about 15 years, that means roughly the government's giving you between $25,000 and $30,000 the government is giving you $25,000 or $30,000. Sorry for that. Just give me a second. So it's giving you about a gift of $30,000 over the life of an electric car, and that can make the purchase very appealing. It's still, it's not for everybody. We hear a lot about electric vehicle sales have zoomed up, and they have zoomed up, but twice of nearly nothing is still very little. So actually electric vehicles, even in Quebec, which is the leader in Canada, still account for less than 1 in 10 new vehicles sold. That's really what's happening in the market. And to a certain degree, until recently, the car makers weren't even sure they could sell that many electrical vehicles. But recently, as in the last year, we've seen a shift in thinking, where now the issue is there isn't a big enough supply, and people are actually lining up for an electric vehicle. To make the switch to a full electric, you obviously need charging. The charging infrastructure in Quebec is pretty good. It's the best probably in North America right now, with maybe the exception of California or 1 or 2 other places. But the real thing that people want is a charger at home. So if you live in a condominium or in a situation where there's a shared parking garage, that may or may not be realistic right now. And for many people who are in that kind of living arrangement, the full electric is not going to be their next vehicle. It's going to be their second vehicle from now, because they need to wait for the infrastructure at home to catch up. If you are driving a full electric, it's not quite as carefree for intercity driving as driving a gasoline vehicle, because the charging infrastructure isn't as certain. If you're following major arteries, so the highway between Montreal and Toronto, the coverage is very good, or Montreal and Quebec City, the coverage is very good. If you're going into the US, unless you have a Tesla where they have their own charging network, where Tesla were smart, they don't put one charger in an unlit parking lot at night. Or two chargers, and one of the plugs is broken, and the other one has somebody who parked their car there 8 hours ago and hasn't left. So they were smarter. They grouped their chargers a bit like filling stations. And so a Tesla owner has access to a reliable network of chargers, and they're in banks. And if one of them isn't working, it's offline. There's another 7 that are. Even when they're busy, within half an hour, one of the 6 or 7 people that are there is going to show up to remove their vehicle. So certainly for someone that is planning on an electric vehicle that is for intercity travel, probably that brand still has an advantage over everybody else. It won't be there forever, but it is there right now. For local travel, once you go electric, it's quiet. The car has very instant response. Most people find it very peaceful compared to a gasoline vehicle, and they generally enjoy it. Most people who make the switch don't regret it afterward, even though there is some inconvenience. Reliability of electric vehicles right now is much worse than gasoline vehicles. They've all had teething problems, big recalls in some cases that took them off the road for months or required their owners to park them outside. I know that the automotive press are, sort of parroting the thing that an electric car has many fewer parts, so it's going to be more reliable. That may be true one day, but it's not true today. So for now, it varies depending on the model, but generally speaking, your likelihood of having issues getting a proper repair or waiting for parts are going to be greater with an electric vehicle than not. One of the big concerns when making the switch is that availability is not good. So if you're signing today, it's for delivery in 4 to 6 months in some cases. In other cases, it could be 1 to 2 years. And so that's one reason why people also, the demand jumped, because it's the same conversation we had earlier about scarcity. In 2008, people stayed out of the market. There was an abundance of vehicles. In 2020, 2021, it was the opposite. When there was a shortage of vehicles, instead of staying out of the market, I think it created kind of a demand or an emotional need to try and get your vehicle in before before they ran out. And so that has happened with electric vehicles. So it has absolutely fueled the demand. One of the solutions APA likes that is a transitional solution is what's called a hybrid. Now, some hybrids you can plug in and they will run on pure battery power for 50 to 70 kilometers. So that means for most of your daily errands, you're in an electric car. When you need to travel a longer distance, it turns into a gas car. After 70 kilometers, there's a regular gas tank, the engine comes on, and you are able to drive intercity or longer distances on gasoline power. A vehicle like that, you might be filling up once every month. And if you drive mostly locally, you may only be filling it up a couple of times a year. It's a very good solution in the interim also because it uses about a quarter of the metals, requires about a quarter of the ecologically and questionable labor practices that you find in mines that are getting the metals for batteries that are problematic, because there is definitely a pollution related to that. And we wish that the industry would have embraced the hybrid solution more, because the early hybrid models that came out that were plug-in, the Chevrolet Volt, for example, turned out to be very good. There's a small number of Toyotas that are also plug-in. They've turned out to be very good vehicles. But in fact, it doesn't seem that it's going to be as strong a way station or as strong a solution as we had thought. So the industry, in many cases, has decided to go full electric instead of sort of going to a partial solution. Not every car maker is the same. Different ones have different approaches. But if you are thinking of a hybrid that you can plug in, most likely it has a very long delivery period, and it will
give you the benefit of electrification as a transitional vehicle. The other kind of hybrid, and this is one that we think will become more common in years to come, you can't plug in. So it's really a gasoline vehicle, but it has a larger battery than your regular car does. That battery could store enough power so that the car will advance a short distance on battery alone power, and the battery can help the engine, help the regular gas engine. And those vehicles typically are Toyotas or Hyundais, and they will get you a fuel savings of about 30% over a conventional gas car. Most of us have tried these vehicles because it's typically what taxi drivers drive. If you've ever been in a Camry cab, in many cases, that's a hybrid vehicle. And that, again, was Toyota introduced, Toyota and Honda, the first hybrids were in the year 2000 in Canada. And Toyota at that time was so confident of the technology that they were sure, they said by 2020, a third of the new cars on the road, all brands, are going to be this kind of hybrid because it's so vastly superior. And in fact, the car was good enough that we could have hoped that if there were a commitment to that, to fuel savings and not larger vehicles, that in fact that would have happened by 2020, but it never did. They're nowhere near 30% of the market. And today, Toyota offers this hybrid technology in almost all of its cars, but they're not able to produce enough. So in the end, most of the hybrids are being sold today. There are some Toyotas that are Hyundai and Kia because they're the ones with the good availability for those brands, for that technology. That requires no adjustment. Vehicle runs like a regular gas car. You wouldn't notice a difference, except that instead of using in town 10 to 12 liters per 100 kilometers, you're around 7 or 8 liters per 100 kilometers. So that's the advantage. A word on the future when everything is electric. So let's just consider that if government doesn't get around to actually taxing electric vehicles at the same level as a gas vehicle, there's no question everybody's going to switch over to electric. The fuel cost is 1/8 or 1/6 of a gasoline vehicle. It's going to probably have some version of automated driving because that's coming. So you're going to be able to, I don't know if they're going to formally allow it, but people will be doing other tasks. After all, we already have long conversations in our cars using our phones. That's permitted on hands-free. So, and your car can read your text. Your car can send emails for you. In most cases, the newer vehicles have those features. So our prediction is if we have that, that rather than reducing driving, it's probably going to increase driving. And we're not going to really deal with the issue of congestion if the vehicle costs less to fuel and there's 4 empty seats in it at rush hour while people are standing on public transit. So we do really need a rethink. And the most radical reorganization of our transportation that has occurred is not because of electrification. It's not even because of self-driving or partly self-driving cars. It's because of COVID and teleworking. The fact that people are not commuting in the same numbers at exactly the same time, 5 days a week, holds a promise for getting more out of our infrastructure. Because for off-peak periods, it's very effective. We built so many roads, you can get to everywhere you want to as long as not everybody else is trying to get to the same place at the same time. What I find disappointing, unfortunately, is there's no conversation around carpooling or increasing the utilization of the vehicle, making it easy. Initially, when people like Uber came out, this is in San Francisco now, more than 10 years ago, the thinking was that it might be a way of using unused demand. So it wasn't a professional, unlicensed cab driver, muscling in on the market of a regulated industry. Initially, the thinking was it might be a ride share where you were making the trip anyway and you could pick up somebody using an app on your way in. In fact, it didn't play itself out that way. But it would be, for me, I think, a really important step forward if vehicles had more than one person in them at rush hour, if it was conceivable that there'd be 2 or 3 or even 4 people in a vehicle. And oddly enough, the car is actually very efficient when it's full. You know, if your car gets roughly the equivalent of, let's say, 8 liters per 10 liters per 100 kilometers today, or so let's say 35 miles per gallon, with 4 people aboard, it's the equivalent of 120 miles per gallon for each passenger. That's actually a pretty efficient way to get around. And the driver is free because the driver is already trained. It's not a paid professional. It's someone who drives every day already. And so conceivably, there would be the opportunity to make our infrastructure much more effective with what we already have. But I don't really see a push for it. And the last word is public transit. COVID was devastating to public transit. First of all, working at home emptied public transit. And then the risk of contagion and the issues of distancing spooked a lot of people. And so the transit companies in many cities still have not gotten to near their old riderships back. And they're now trying to figure out what patterns are going to look like in the future. You know, and in many cases, they're also dealing with an aging group of bus drivers and having to go on a hiring spree, or because that's also an issue that's happening. So I don't know what will happen with transit going forward. The most significant positive environmental thing, believe it or not, is probably working from home right now. I'd be interested in taking your questions on EVs if there are any now. And I'll tell you why, because often for many people, it boils down to what model do I buy? And we can, at that, we talk about some of the advantages and drawbacks of the different ones.
Thank you very much, George. Yes, we have some questions that have come in. Could you please comment on electric cars, particularly in our winter weather? Like, is there any disadvantages or advantages to it?
So there are 2 issues in winter with an electric vehicle. The battery offers less performance. So you're going to have less range, roughly 30% to 40% less range. Some cars, surprisingly, the drop is even greater. But if your vehicle arrives with about 400 kilometers of range, first of all, you're never going to drive 400 kilometers, even in summer, because it's too risky. So you probably drive about 300 to 320 because you need to get to a charging station or you need to get to your home. If you're traveling intercity, there's always a risk that the charging station has a broken charger or there's offline for some reason. So you kind of need a reserve to get to the second charging station. So your 320 in summer is going to be about 220 to 250 in winter. That's the reality. There are some models as well where we've had concerns about the heat. People tell us that in very cold weather, -20 or lower, the heat is no good. So Tesla had that issue last year. They fixed it. Ford has it with the Mustang. And we don't know if they've really addressed the issue. And so down to -20, not much issues. Below that, with some EVs, there are concerns. And what people are doing to kind of stretch the range of the battery is if you plug the car at home, you can do what's called a preheat if it's parked outside. So the whole interior of the car is warmed up for you when you come in, but using the power off your house current. And the batteries are warmed up as well using the power off your home current so that they're at peak performance, at least initially when you get in the car.
Okay, thank you. Well, there's also been questions about fires. I've heard some electric charging systems causing fires. So where would be the best place to install a charging station in your home?
Forget about the charging station. It's the car that catches fire. And this is something that's important to cover. Right now, an electric vehicle that catches fire needs at least 10 times as much water as a gasoline vehicle to put out the fire. There's 2 reasons. One, the battery pack is under the floor and it's sealed. Very hard to get water where it needs to be to cool down the battery. Requires a lot more than just aiming a hose at an engine compartment of the vehicle, for example. Second, with a conventional fuel, a gasoline vehicle that's caught fire, it does need oxygen from the air. So if you're able to smother the fire, you can put it out. With a car battery, it's different. All the reagents needed to create the heat are inside the battery already. So what you need is the water to cool the battery below the level at which it wants to combust. But it actually doesn't need the air around the vehicle. So it's a much harder fire to put out. The electric vehicle will almost always be completely destroyed. And then the concern is how much destruction around it. It's a hotter fire. It's harder to put out. And even though the car makers in some cases have delivered instructions for fire departments, and there's now training for them on EVs, realistically, there isn't much, we're not anywhere near an effective solution. What we believe in the long run is a model from Europe where they will bring about some kind of inflatable pool or something like that and a crane, because that's what ends up working, is dumping the car in a body of water, cools it down and stops the fire. There have been cases where electric vehicle fires were put out and a few hours later the car caught fire again. And the reason is there was still energy in the batteries. So even though they were maybe wet and they were not exposed to oxygen, there was still enough latent energy in the battery to restart the fire. I think we're going to have we have already had some very large vehicle recalls that would not have probably happened for a gas vehicle. The car makers, after just a couple of reports, were unnerved and recalled an entire year's, in GM's case, 3 or 4 years of production of the Bolt, Hyundai, a complete year's production of the Kona. And these are, in the case of Hyundai, their gasoline engines are catching fire all over the country every second or third day. And they didn't care for a long time. But when it was their electric vehicle, there was an understanding that the risk was much greater and it would ruin the halo of the car. So they're much more careful about recalls. But putting out an electric vehicle fire, I don't think we've heard the last word on that yet.
Okay, and we've also had someone ask too, with the, okay, it says the government will tax electricity for car usage to replace the revenue loss as electrical vehicles become more popular. Do you think that's true, that they will?
First of all, they're not telling you that, which they should, since it's a 15-year purchase. They should say, get in now on the ground floor while it's good. Secondly, it wouldn't be convenient because I don't think they're going to want to retrofit all of the metering systems, for example. So the way you would have to do it would be with a registration fee. So if you have an electric vehicle, instead of paying $100 a year to register it in your province, maybe it would be $100 a month. That would be the correct way, so that the EV user is paying their fair share of the use of the infrastructure. While EVs are 3% of the complete fleet, which is like the level now or less, it's not so much of a concern. We can look the other way, but there is absolutely a failure of policy and also a failure of communication, because EV buyers should be told that one day that honeymoon will be over and you're going to have to pay up. And if you bought a car with a $600 or $700 payment, you're going to be angry when it costs you another $150 a month to run it. So someone should tell you that now, not later after you bought the vehicle.
Really good point. That's a really, really good point. Also, someone's been asking about the batteries. Are they dreadful on the environment and landfills?
The car makers are like the plastic manufacturers. They tell us, don't worry, we're going to have a system in place to recycle them when they're done. We want those metals back. But in fact, the way the batteries are made and the way they're encased makes them difficult to recycle, and they're not standardized between brands. So we have to hope that when large numbers of these vehicles start coming off the road, that in fact the batteries will be recycled into power packs or other things. That's what we were told, or broken down and the expensive metals extracted. There'll be a lot of plastic and a lot of junk in the battery cases that you won't be able to be recycling. The more sober analyses that we have seen would suggest an electric vehicle, when you correct for the mining and the additional resources and energy to make it, is about 3 years behind a gas vehicle before it reaches parity. After the third year, the gas vehicle's emissions of CO2 and other gases are so great just from burning gasoline that in a market like Quebec, where your hydro is 100%, where your electricity is 100% hydro, the electric vehicle pulls ahead. In other markets, by the way, where your electricity comes from coal or oil, it could take much longer before you reach that parity.
Okay, okay. And another question we have, is there a car company that rents the battery for the electric car, or is it purchase only?
There might be, periodically they have come up with the idea that instead of leasing the car, we'll just lease you the battery. That will keep the price of the acquisition down. But I don't think the industry is that's going to ever get widespread traction. The industry would much rather lease you the whole car. They're already equipped to do that if you want to lease the vehicle, and not be stuck with batteries in addition that they would have to manage separately from cars.
Okay, well, thank you, George. I think that's the end for our questions right now. Ruth, if you want to.
Sure, thanks, Anne. That was marvelous and great discussion. George, you did touch upon specifics for older drivers, so I don't know there was anything more briefly to add, because we then have your last topic, and I'm just being aware of the time because we'll have a question period after that. So I leave it up to you how you want to lead this last portion.
So some things for older drivers. So of course, this is a very much growing group of the driving population because it follows demographics, and we're following the boom as the boomers get into the bulge from the boom as it reaches past age 65. So the researchers have now divided the older driving population really into two cohorts. So the first one would be, age 60 roughly to 70 or 75. So in that age group, the individuals who are behind the wheel are feeling some decline. So your eyesight might not be as sharp. It might be an issue of your vision close by is not as good. Your hearing may not be as good. You don't like driving late into the night as much. Glare is more of a problem. There might be issues with mobility. So getting in and out of a car, that twisting motion can be more of a hassle than it used to be. This group overall has an excellent driving record. And so what they find is that our behaviors compensate for physical decline. As we get older also, we seem to have better impulse control than the youngest level of certainly male drivers. So people between 16 and 30, generally they're at their peak physical condition, but they have higher collision involvement because they're not as much in control of their more impulsive behaviors. Older drivers also, because it's harder for us to process, and this starts gradually, but it could be like an intersection where you're making a left turn and there's a lot going on, or you're checking for bicycles in your blind spot on a new bike lane, tend to be, for that reason, make adjustments that involve taking more time to do certain maneuvers, and that also more than compensates for any decline in, say, processing ability, for example. This is also a point where you're still able to learn most of the functions of your new car that has like a completely different radio and phone hookup system from maybe the older vehicle that you had before. So you're still able to assimilate that. And it's a point where probably in your household, there's two people who are still competent to drive. But after retirement, often only one person does all of the driving. That's a bad idea. You both need to stay in shape as drivers, not just on longer trips where one spells the other, but for every day, because of you don't know who might need a driver in the house going forward. So if one person has already not been driving, say, in city traffic for 10 years or 12 years, it will be a lot dicier if the principal driver in the household is incapacitated further down the road. After 80, you get declines. So at that point, collision rates per driver remain low, but collision rates per mile or per kilometer driven start to climb very significantly. And older drivers per kilometer are as involved in collisions as the youngest drivers, oddly enough. The difference is older drivers are driving less. And they're also making many adjustments to improve their risk. And this is a picture of, first of all, they will avoid peak traffic times. They can afford to, they have control over their schedules. They'll stay on routes that they know. They'll avoid driving at night. Many of them, although they're not aware that there's actually a physiological imperative, will not drink or drink very, very little before they're driving. That's also a big plus because the impairment can be more of a function as you get on. In many cases also, they'll stick to destinations they know. Primary ones, of course, are medical and food. But by staying on roads that you know and possibly avoiding certain roads that you think are tricky, you also improve your profile. At some point, you are going to be in a situation where the impairment is significant and you probably shouldn't be on the road anymore. One thing that is almost certain is that you're going to be the last person to realize that. Very difficult for us to know when there's a gradual drop off in our performance, that it's actually happening. So one of the telltales is that your relatives don't want to get in the car with you. That would be an example. Or your friends are always offering to drive. We were told those are two very good cues. So if people you know are saying, no, I'm going to drive, then you can perhaps in a moment of candor ask them, would you be comfortable if I were doing the driving? If they tell you yes and they're being honest, at least you can bank on it. But if they say no, then maybe it's time to consider at least getting an assessment. Doctors have told us that one of the hardest things to tell a patient, you'd be surprised, aside from that they have a potentially terminal disease, is that they are going to recommend that they stop driving. They said it's a very difficult thing to do for them, especially if they've known the patient a long time, because the patient and them have a relationship of trust, and they knew the patient when they were perfectly able to drive and are now being asked to make a judgment call. There is a government examination process as well, in addition to a medical test, because the medical is the start, that's the physician one. And I have actually seen people who lost their license get it back after the test, but only twice. And I've been around a long time. So I imagine that either there's a certain bias once you've lost it to keep you off the road, or in the alternative, maybe the reasons that originally were responsible for you losing the right to drive were actually sound reasons. And I think it's something to consider fairly. It's also why I said after 80, you probably don't want to be leasing a car, because that's assuming you're going to be fined for a period of anywhere from 3 to 5 years, which may or may not be the case. And second, if you are going to make a vehicle purchase and you're going for the longer term, then buy something that a vehicle in your 70s where you're going to be able to learn and know the controls, because your next vehicle probably is going to look like a computer tablet, basically, and you're going to know how to do 3 things on it. It's just not learnable after a certain point. Even most people, even who are much younger, do not learn all the functions of the vehicles. Have become ridiculously complex to learn because everybody's trying to copy Tesla and push as many controls away from conventional buttons toward a pad because it looks modern. Eventually, it's also going to be cheaper to make a vehicle with a big iPad controlling everything than separate buttons. But it's not going to be easier to use. All the studies we're seeing now, there's not many, have shown that simple tasks, adjusting things, takes 3 or 4 times as long, and your eyes are off the road. And that's with drivers who are at the top of their shape in these studies to do than using the older controls that were separate buttons, large knobs that were around, push buttons that you could see, things that were labeled. Buttons that did one thing that couldn't push a menu, and then suddenly they all convert to doing something else. All of that requires a lot of time off the road. So it would make sense to purchase a vehicle in your 70s that might be the vehicle you're going to keep for 10 or 15 years or more. It's going to see you to the end of your driving if that's the case.
Okay, well, thank you, George. We do have some questions that came in before, if I could get them to you. Someone was asking about the Honda HR-V. Is it good for a senior?
Yes, that's exactly the type of in-between size that we were looking at, that we were
Perfect.
mentioning. And the other nice thing about the HR-V is it's a little higher, but it's also quite trim. And one of the things that we do see with seniors after age 80 is the corners of the car get dinged. So the corners of the bumper or the door, because you hit something when opening it in a garage, because there was clutter and you didn't see it. Those are very common. So a smaller vehicle like an HR-V will be less prone to doing it. You're not going to scrape a pillar as easily. And I haven't driven the new one. The previous one was an exception in the sense that it had pretty good visibility out of the vehicle. That's true also of most Subaru models, but most vehicles now have terrible outward visibility when you're looking back. The windows line is too high and you need to use a camera.
Okay, well, that's a good endorsement for the HR-V for sure. And also someone was asking that their insurance stayed pretty much the same when they switched they switched a car to a cross-check. And they don't drive very, very much. Should their insurance be going down? Like does the insurance doesn't seem to be decreasing from what some people are saying?
Well, right now insurance is increasing generally because the cost of repairs are going up and car theft is going up. So if you're holding the same premium, that's pretty good. And if you switch to an SUV from a car, it will cost more because an SUV costs more than a car. So if you're holding the same line and the same premium and you brought a brand new car, you're doing very well.
That's wonderful. I think that's it for the questions that we have right now. Does anybody want to put a question in the chat and we'll be happy to ask George to answer it?
Well, perhaps they can put it in the interim, Anne, and then George can go on to the last subject and we can throw it in at that point because, time is moving on.
So the last topic is dealer extras. And this is basically the things that they sell you that do not come from the factory. So among those, the one that we like is the extended warranty. So if you're buying a vehicle and you plan to use the dealer for service, it can make sense to have an extra warranty if you're going to keep the vehicle past 5 years. Because you have the assurance that when you go in, mostly everything is covered. There's predictability. The extended warranty that we recommend comes from the manufacturer. You have to be sure, not one from an aftermarket supplier. Dealers will sometimes slip in a lesser warranty because the car maker limits their markup to about 30%. So if they're selling you a warranty for $3,000, their margin on it is probably about $800 to $900. That's what they're making on that sale. If they were to sell you a warranty from a third-party company, so not from the brand that sold you the car, but somebody else, they could be making 50 or 60% markup. They love that kind of gravy. So you want to be sure that if, let's say you're buying a warranty on a Hyundai, it comes from Hyundai. When you're buying one of these warranties, we recommend you go for full coverage. So a lot of times people think, well, it's the engine. I don't want the engine to blow. That's an expensive part. Today, in most cases, engines are pretty reliable, but there's a lot of very expensive electronics, parts you never heard of. And you want a warranty that covers those as well. You don't want big gaps in the parts that are covered. Air conditioning has become expensive. It would appear on a modern car, just the basic charge for an air conditioning repair once they've determined what the problem is about $1,000 or more. So you want air conditioning to be included. Another feature that's available that we love that is underused and often not offered is prepaid maintenance. So for about $1,200 or $1,500, the car maker sells a plan where basically if you go in twice a year for your service, everything is covered, even the oil changes. The only thing that might not be covered are tires. And it's well worth it because oddly enough, they're underpricing it. So your savings would be about 30 to 35% over paying for those services individually. Plus, because the car maker is paying, there's less opportunity for the dealer to do tricks. If you're going in for a 24,000 kilometer inspection paid for by, let's say, Nissan on a Nissan product, the dealer can't sell you the oil treatment or the something flush because Nissan would never pay for junk like that. So there's no upsell. You're just going in with your warranty to get the, with your, prepaid maintenance to get the service, especially with luxury cars where the cost of the service is exorbitant. So on a BMW, that service, the prepaid maintenance is standard, but if you're buying an Audi or a Mercedes, we strongly recommend it, and many people do take it. Other things that dealers sell are mostly junk. So some of them will offer you replacement cost value. That means if your vehicle is stolen or if it's written off after a collision, you'll get a settlement for the full amount. You can get a brand new vehicle. We believe in that coverage, but dealers abuse it. They have very high commissions, over 60% for selling the coverage, and they make you pay for it up front. Your insurer offers you similar coverage on your policy that you pay annually. So you're not paying interest on it ahead of time because you didn't have to buy all 5 years ahead of time. And if you sell your vehicle before 5 years, or the vehicle is written off or stolen and you collect on it, you haven't prepaid for a bunch of years that you'll never use because you pay for it annually. So definitely it's a good product. It's an insurance product, but buy it from an insurance company, in most cases from your insurer, or at least check the prices. Dealers will sell you a rust proofing, generally speaking, a poor bet because it's badly done. We do believe if you're keeping a vehicle a long time, and it's particularly if it's a brand where there is some issue with the corrosion protection, that you should get something in the aftermarket that's better. We do recommend two products. One is called Crown. It's an annual product. The other one is Barry's Rust Proofing, which is the one that is in Montreal that we recommend to the largest number of our members. And that's just a small local shop that does very careful work. If you're leasing a vehicle, dealers offer you something called wear care. It's worth it for peace of mind, but it's very expensive. And what it will offer you is the dings that you get that you would not claim on insurance because they're too small, the wheel rims that hit the sidewalk that get damaged when you were parallel parking are covered under the wear care, so that at the end of your lease, there is an inspection and you are protected from lease return charges. If you're careful yourself naturally, don't accumulate the dings, save yourself the $1,500 the dealer wants because it's an expensive service. Some car brands have now begun offering it at a better price for their lease customers directly from the manufacturer. Those we prefer. So that Honda, Toyota, a few other companies are now offering it. If you can get the one offered by the brand car and not by the aftermarket, that would be something to look at. Remote starters, APA doesn't care for. It's a comfort feature. We don't think a vehicle should be unattended with the engine running. So we would prefer in that case that you have, if you do get one, you might get one installed by the dealer, and I'll tell you why. It's no better, the quality. It will cost you a bit more, and they don't usually install it themselves. They have somebody come in and do it, who might be the same person you would be seeing. But if they did the install and there's a problem later, they cannot tell you that your remote starter voided the warranty on the car for the problem. That's one big advantage. So that's it for the features. I'd be happy if there's any wrap-up questions. Otherwise, I think we're pretty much done.
Thank you so much, George. You've been just great with all this information. We do have a question. You have spoken about purchasing or leasing, but is there anything we are responsible to ensure or do if we are selling a car? Is there any responsibility?
So you're selling privately?
Yes,
Let's say?
privately.
I'm assuming, yeah. So what the law allows you to do if you're selling privately, a dealer must offer a warranty on a vehicle. Even if a dealer writes on the contract, no warranty, there is still an assumption that the vehicle is fit to drive at the time of sale. So no warranty is ignored. As a private seller, you have the option of selling with or without a warranty. We usually tell most private sellers, you should probably on the receipt put that the vehicle is sold as is with no warranty. However, the law does draw a line at fraud or deception. If you know something important about the vehicle, you're supposed to declare it. In theory, a private buyer could come back against you. In practice, they rarely do, but it could happen. And certainly if you're selling to a friend or a relative, I would encourage you to have the vehicle looked at by somebody else. Tell them to do it, just to get it off your plate so it's not your responsibility anymore, because things actually do break. There could be something that could come up 2 weeks later, and you didn't know about it, neither did they. But at least if someone has looked at the vehicle, it's the responsibility is more clear. And finally, a dealer, if you're selling to a dealer, in theory, the dealer is considered an expert and they're supposed to know. So people routinely sell vehicles that they know need work to dealers. They trade them in. They don't declare. They want the highest value. And the dealer does a very cursory inspection. Very once in a while, when it's like a major repair, I don't know, the transmission was about to pack it in and the dealer didn't notice it because you drove in with a warmed up car and the defect only shows on a cold morning. We have seen dealers sue customers, but they normally don't. They take it as a business loss. Ethically, that's not correct, but that is in fact why many vehicles are traded, because the owner knows it's going to need work and their position is, you know, I'm dealing with an expert. It's up to them to do their diligence. I mean, very few cars, unless it's a very unusual vehicle, are put on a lift by a dealer before they put a price on it. So theoretically, they're relying on your representations as to the condition of the vehicle and a visual exam. You look around.
Great, good, some sound advice there. Also, could you please repeat the recommended rust-proofing area, dealership or place that you were speaking about?
So it's on the APA website.
Okay.
It's a small hole-in-the-wall shop. It's called Barry's Rust Proofing. We've been recommending them for over 40 years. Barry himself has retired, 91, but his associate took over. And what they do is grease-based, so it won't drip like oil. Also doesn't have to be repeated every year. And they don't drill holes. So that's one of the concerns car makers sometimes have. They don't want people drilling holes in their vehicle. Dealers usually do. And they will go in through access panels or drains that are built into the car body. It takes more time. It takes about half a day to 2/3 of a day, and it's a little more expensive. Long run, it will be cheaper because you're not redoing it every year, and the protection is excellent. The advantage of grease and oil is both creep. Car makers tend to use a waxy-like substance, which is good in the first years, but when it gets, car dealers, but when it gets older, it cracks and can trap moisture.
Okay, wow, that's great. So I think that's it for the questions. I want to thank you, George, and I'll be passing it on to Ruth, but it's been very informative and wonderful. Thank you so much.
In good times, I would make a very strong pitch to use our used car buying service if you're buying used. But right now, the wait list is just very long. We're not able to, the dealers we work, to tell you that we could find you the vehicle you want. We do have a car hunter that we recommend. He charges $400 for that. So if you're buying used and you really have no knowledge on your own, that might be a good way to go. If you're buying new, You won't get your car any faster with the APA, but you will be dealing with an honest and reputable party, and it's worth a lot.
George, I can't thank you enough. I know you're under the gun. You're very busy these days. I know you've taken time out of hectic time to do this for us. Everyone, getting notes in the chat box. Everyone was thrilled with the presentation, with the information. If people want to unmute themselves and give them a round of applause, thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. The questions were great. It was a great group. And I wish you all, a good experience with your next car purchase.
Thank you. And you stay in touch, George, and everybody else. We have other webinars coming up. I think you've all received lists of them. So please check them out, and we look forward to having you join us. October is on volunteer governing boards. Perhaps you're on a board, perhaps you're considering volunteering, you know someone else who is. It's going to be another expert. November, because of the cost of everything, and right before the holidays, we're going to talk about finances and budgeting. And we'll have a bank expert, we'll have a money coach and budgeting coach. And we'll also have a lawyer who can talk about if people are in serious trouble, voluntary deposits and personal bankruptcy and the impact of it. And December, because they're out in full force now, coming up with new ideas how to get our money and how to rob us, is the frauds and scams. And the holiday time when people are busy and shopping online and using credit cards, we're going to have 3 experts, 2 from government departments, the Anti-Fraud Center, Competition Bureau for Small Businesses, and a financial institution employee who will talk about frauds and scams. And then in February and March, we have 2 others. So that's enough for right now, and hope you'll sign up. I'm taking registrations now, even in advance. Be safe, be good to each other, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.